I think we might as well start slowly. It's 12:02, so please do mute yourselves if you have not done that so far. I'd like to welcome everyone to our Global Citizenship online seminar, which, as we talked with Ashley, we had hoped would be in person, but this essentially format allows us to have many of you here who otherwise would not have been able to join us at DUI. Our seminar series is organized by the Global Citizenship Research Area as a forum for discussing work in progress. So today we have as a speaker Ashley Manta-Hollands, who's a research fellow at the International Citizenship Law Project Group at the WCB, a PhD candidate at Humboldt University, and our research assistant here at GlobalCit. Ashley will be presenting her work on citizenship links in a global perspective. So I would kindly ask Ashley now to speak for about 20 minutes at most. And after that, we will open the floor for questions and answers. Those who have registered for this session have received also the paper in advance. So please feel free to offer your feedback to Ashley. So without further ado, Ashley, please go ahead.
Thanks, Jelena, and thanks to Martin also for organizing this these seminar sessions. I was saying before we started, you know, when I applied for this in September, October, I thought 100% I would be doing this in Florence, and you know, as usual, eating way too much pasta and at least having a celebratory drink of wine with you all after it's over. But I guess it is what it is, and I'm happy to be here nonetheless, and really grateful to see some familiar and also new faces in the audience. So I'll just share my screen with you, and we can get started. So I'll be presenting today my working paper and ongoing project called Citizenship Links in a Global Perspective. And the starting point for my dissertation, or this working paper is part of my dissertation, and the starting point was sort of start to explore this contested concept in citizenship and legal theory of the genuine link doctrine, looking at when and how it's been applied, asking whether it's a good law, and whether and how it can be considered as an international legal norm for citizenship. So this presentation of the working paper that was circulated is sort of my fledgling attempt to start unpacking these very big questions. And I'll start with a brief introductory slide on the genuine link, and then go into the meat of the presentation, which is the conceptualization of citizenship links and the proposal of how we might create a genuine link test. So instead of going too much into the actual Notabom case, I thought I would just present the state of the debate over the genuine link principle. So now the doctrine originates, as many of you are aware, in this case presented to the International Court of Justice in 1955, involving a claim of diplomatic protection. And without getting into too much of the weeds of the case, the majority held that in order for such a claim to be made, the country in question needed to establish both that the person was indeed a national under its law, and that the person held a genuine connection to the country. And this is where the famous phrase on the slide comes from. But what is often conflated in discussions about the case is whether this principle applies to the acquisition of nationality or the recognition of said nationality in diplomatic disputes. And I guess what is useful to point out is that it was quite controversial from the outset, as if we agree that the case is about the recognition of nationality, it makes the exercise of diplomatic protection contingent on the presence of some social facts of membership. So it's kind of on this basis that the doctrine is problematic in the eyes of some legal scholars. And I think part of the fear with drawing conclusions from Notabom was that if the status of citizen is contingent on potentially undefined or vague social facts, it could lead to abuse by states, or leave individuals stateless. So, or for example, it could support a conditional model of citizenship where only those that can satisfy this criteria have access to all the associated rights or protection. But nevertheless, I don't think this is the basis to ignore a substantially different normative question: whether or not it is good practice for a state to base the acquisition or loss of citizenship on a genuine link criterion. And if so, what would such a criterion look like? So it is in this sense that political theorists have appropriated the concept of genuine link as a normative approach to questions about democratic theory and citizenship's over and under inclusive nature. And I go into this in a bit more detail in the paper, but I think that these theorists make quite a convincing argument that a normative principle of genuine link is quite a useful standard to have in terms of regulating the acquisition and loss of citizenship. And since the Nottebohm case, the genuine link principle has been used more broadly in discussions about the regulation of citizenship acquisition and loss. In January 2019, a report from the Commission to the European Parliament on Investor Citizenship asserted that some genuine link is necessary between person and state for citizenship acquisition. And in March 2019, the European Court of Justice also drew on the genuine link in cases of citizenship loss. The Chebes case centers around a provision in Dutch law that authorizes the loss of citizenship for a national who is resident outside the Netherlands for 10 years or more. And the European Court of Justice upheld the Dutch law, citing the genuine link principle. The genuine link also comes up sometimes to criticize unlimited descent-based citizenship acquisition, such as with states that offer citizenship to many generations born abroad. And I think part of the puzzle with genuine link is that it somehow gets kind of thrown around as a quick fix without defining some clear standards as how it might be assessed. So this is what I try to do here. And so I can ask which provisions comply with this principle, what would a citizenship regime based around this principle look like, and which laws that govern the acquisition and loss of citizenship would be forsaken. So I start this endeavor by trying to dive into what exactly a link is. And this conceptual framework of links presented here comes from a paper that both Jelena and I are working on that looks at the varying degrees of Europeanization in the different realms of links of the member states in the EU. And so using the global CIT typology, we suggest that citizenship links can be seen as umbrella categories for different modes of citizenship acquisition and that are mirrored through the modes of citizenship loss, which is to say that similar assumptions about citizenship are used when discussing both citizenship acquisition and loss in each domain of link. And I think this is what makes the typology unique from previous categorizations of links, is that we can kind of highlight this connection. So this echoing takes place through 4 categories of grounds for acquiring and losing citizenship. So we have descent and kinship, territory, sponsor, and merit and contribution. So descent and kinship-based modes of acquisition and loss link citizens to the state based on either biological ties or presumed ethnocultural characteristics. And the reason that descent and kinship are grouped together under one category is that while in some cases the provisions that govern these modes of citizenship acquisition see descent and kinship independently, in other cases they are very much intertwined, and I do give some examples of that in the paper. So in certain states, these links can extend through multiple generations born abroad. In others, the link is broken after the first or second generation born outside the territory of the original citizenship. So second, we have territory-based modes of acquisition and loss, which imagines citizens linked through a connection to the physical boundaries of the state. This can either occur at birth or over time, for example, with W. Soli. Ordinary residence-based naturalization is placed under this category of link, as even though it is typically paired with other conditions, usually these conditions cannot be satisfied outside the borders of the particular country. And in some states, territory-based links can be severed after a period of residency abroad. So then the third category of link are sponsor-based modes, which link individuals to states through a state citizen or an applicant for naturalization. And the overarching view here is that citizenship is transmissible through marriage or other forms of family relations. For some states, this can be broken if the original citizen loses their citizenship, causing a ripple effect to the other family members. And finally, we have merit and contribution-based links. And these are when the state recognizes a particular performance or attribute as a formal connection in terms of citizenship acquisition. So for example, in order to advance national interests. So under this category of link, we'd include acquisition for special achievements or public services or financial assets. And for citizenship loss, if a particular performative script is not followed, then the citizenship is lost. And here we'd include service in a foreign army or country, disloyalty or treason, or fraudulent acquisition, for example. So here are the modes within each category of link. And it would be great at the end to discuss some of the harder to place cases. Rainer has already pointed some out to me in his comments on the paper. So yeah, I'd be grateful to hear from all of you on some of your thoughts. And so what I'd like to do with this typology is to have a closer look into each of the categories of links, how they are operationalized by states, and test different hypotheses within each of the categories of links across states and potentially over time. So showing how some areas of citizenship laws will be shaped by certain factors while others will not. And I started to talk about this a bit in the working paper, but of course it needs further development. And I'd be extra curious to hear from those of you who study citizenship outside of Europe and North America, if you think such a framework can be applied and compared in countries that you study. So assessing the genuine link. So in a recent Global Cit working paper, Martijn van den Brink replies to some of the main objections to using a principle of genuine link to regulate the boundaries of membership. And he writes that it is possible to determine some practical standards to serve as proxies for genuine links, and that while these practical standards might be over and under inclusive, this isn't a sufficient basis to reject the principle outright. And I propose the genuine link not as an evaluative test to measure a particular individual's social ties to the state, but to look at the provisions that govern citizenship acquisition and loss to see if, based on these three proxies, we can assume a genuine link between the individual and state. And I argue that we need to use these proxies differently depending on the category of link we are looking at. And I think such a proposal might help with the under-inclusive critique that Martijn van den Brink alludes to. So I focus on residency, time, and procedure as the practical standards to determine whether a provision for citizenship acquisition or loss complies with the principle. So just to go into each of these briefly, so residency is of course one of the most cited proxies in the literature for testing whether there is a genuine link between a person and state. And to be used as a proxy for genuine link for each of the categories of link, I argue that whose residency we're using to determine the genuine link varies. So for example, residency for the individual is required to establish a genuine link in the realm of probably most of the categories of links, except for perhaps descent and kinship-based links, where the residency of the parent may suffice in passing down the citizenship to the child. And perhaps in terms of sponsor-based links, the residency criteria, we could see the residency criterion being split between the current state citizen and the person to which the citizenship is being transferred. The second proxy is time, and I suggest two relevant time periods that are deployed by the state as a tool for citizenship inclusion and exclusion, and that is generational time, and so we can think of that as lineage, and durational time. So these are deadlines, age limits, or waiting periods. So for example, for descent and kinship-based links, we would need to look at generational time horizons and set a generation for when the link is broken. I suggest in the paper that a link could be broken after the first or second generation born abroad, but it would be interesting to discuss that with you. In terms of other links, time needs to be considered more in this durational sense, which means that it's based on the particular individual at a specific point in time. So for example, either age limits for WSOD and waiting periods for spouses. But one of the issues I've really been having in thinking about how to operationalize this is how to set a durational time period without being completely arbitrary. So between 3 and 5 years is often cited for ordinary residence-based naturalization, and for citizenship loss after prolonged residency abroad. Our colleague Jules Lepoutre suggests 10 years, which coincides with passport renewal, indicating some administrative ties to the States. But I'd be curious to hear on your thoughts. And the final proxy for assessing if a mode of citizenship acquisition or loss is compatible with the genuine link principle is, I suggest, the procedure. So I argue that procedures that are compatible with the genuine link are those in which the consent of the individual is expressed, as if the genuine link is inherently relational, there should be an expression of consent on both sides. And I think an argument can be made for the automatic acquisition at birth, as the parent has the legal responsibility for the child, in which case can consent on their behalf. But again, I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. So that kind of concludes my presentation. I hope that it gives you a good idea and an overview of my project. Same with the working paper. And some of the interests I have moving forward. And I look forward to your comments and remarks.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for this incredibly interesting and stimulating presentation. I'd like to open the floor for comments and questions from the audience. So please use the raise hand function or switch on your camera and just wave your hand. So I think I'll start with Rainer, and the way we'll go about this is that Ashley will respond immediately after each commentator. So Rainer, please.
Thanks, Jelena and Ashley. Yeah, I think I'm really excited about this project. You know, I've been talking and writing about genuine link as a defensible normative principle for quite a while, but I've never myself tried to operationalize it to see whether this can be used not just as, you know, either an international legal norm, which is disputed, or a norm in political theory, which I think stands on firm grounds, but also as a test criterion to see how state practice takes heed of this or ignores it. You know, it's an open empirical question in the end. You know, to which extent do nationality laws and the way they involve still adhere to a genuine link principle, and in which aspects, in which modes of acquisition and loss do they do this, and which others are increasingly disconnected from that norm. So I've sent you questions on details, so I'll stick to the more general ones. I think the most exciting part is still to come, which is how will you go about, you know, relating this to the data set on modes of acquisition and loss, and what measurements will you use for this? That's still open. So this is a conceptual paper, as I understand it. But starting with the first your table, the grounds of genuine link, the 4 grounds there. First question is, you presented this now as a 2x2 table. That suggests there are hidden dimensions, 2 hidden dimensions, right? That somehow align kinship with merit or align territory with sponsor, or on the horizontal dimension align kinship with territory, etc. So I'm just puzzled. Is the presentation in a 2x2 table accidental, or is there some logic behind this? And I think if you find the logic behind this, it's fantastic, because it shows it has greater explanatory power. If it's not just a bullet point list of potential grounds, but if these are structured along hidden dimensions. My second question is, do you think this is really complete? You know, can you fit all the modes of acquisition and loss into this scheme? And I have some doubts about this. I mentioned one citizenship of a specific country, let's say naturalization preferences for EU citizens in other EU member states. That doesn't seem to me to fit into the descent kinship category at all, but also not in any of the others. There might be a separate ground of some kind of association with other states that is not of a cultural nature. You shouldn't assume that this is about culture. I think this would be plainly wrong for the EU. But that's probably the reason why you put it into this box. Now, my third question is then about what you call the proxies, the residence, time, and procedure. Here again, since this is a conceptual paper, the first question to ask is, do you think each of these are necessary grounds, and together they are sufficient proxies for determining a genuine link? So is the absence of residence, for example, a hard indicator that no genuine link is at play? That would mean that you cut out, that you simply say that jus sanguinis abroad is a violation of a genuine link principle, right? I'm not sure it is, and I will come to that in a second, why I think it can be included. But if you say there must be the condition of residence, of a certain time of residence, and a consent procedure, then that cuts down what counts as a genuine link to a very small core, and I'm not sure that this is appropriate. So the other question is about the procedure, where you put the emphasis on consent. And here again, I think, yes, it's true that a genuine link by definition is a relation between an individual and a state or a polity in a wider sense. But the concept itself does not really say that it has to be explicit consent by both sides. In many cases it isn't. If citizenship is withdrawn, for example, involuntarily, that's a violation of individual consent. But it will be withdrawn in some cases because of an absence of genuine link. This is the Dutch law, after 10 years, you lose it. So consent is there, but it's there only indirectly, not explicit. So you have to do something to prevent it. And again, there are various versions of consent, like Locke explained, there can be implied consent. If you stay on in the status, then you are seen to consent. So if you acquire citizenship by birth, it doesn't mean it's non-consensual, as long as you have an option to renounce it, right? I would be hesitant to go for a very strong explicit notion of consent, because that would narrow it down too much. And I'll finish with the most general comment. Since genuine link by definition is a relational concept, you have to look at both the individual and the polity side of the relation. And my argument has been that on the polity side, we need to be clear what we are talking about. Here we are talking about states, right? And how they configure their membership. And they do this, all states do it by attributing membership at birth. And that tells you something about the nature of the association. It's not an accidental feature of statehood that you acquire membership by birth. It's an essential feature of statehood. This is what I would claim, right? And for that reason, it doesn't make sense to say a genuine link of an individual to a state has to depend on residence rather than birthright. It's the nature of the link that it depends on birthright. If it were not dependent on birthright, it would be something else. And I think that makes sense. I've argued that you can have a genuine link to a city, right? Or to a municipality that is just based on your residence rather than being born there. But that has to do with the nature of the city as a polity that is different from the state. And you might say states may become different. So if citizenship becomes a commodity that you can be bought and sold in the global market, then obviously there will be a genuine link that is based on either residence nor on birthright. It will be an absence of genuine link because we don't have genuine links to the commodities that we own and can buy and sell, right? So that will be the end of the genuine link story. But it would mean that states cease to be the associations of the kind that they currently are. it's naive by the people advocating the global market for investor citizenship to think that you can have states as they are, and this takes over as the primary principle of allocated citizenship. So I see Jelena grinning because I'm going on. I stop it here.
Thank you so much, Rainer. I think that you've given Ashley quite a lot of food for thought. And I think I will let her respond to some of your remarks. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned some of this in your comments in the actual paper itself, and I don't have answers to everything yet. And a lot of these things are things that I'm trying to work through as well. But I'll respond to some of them now. So in terms of the table, I mean, the way I presented it today was really just a matter of presentation, although I have been thinking about the ways in which the links, we can think about these links as intertwined or on different dimensions. I just haven't come up with anything that is worth presenting yet. Is the table complete? I don't think so, and I'm not sure yet. As I said in the presentation, there are some really hard cases, like as you mentioned, citizenship of a specific country. At the moment, I have that under descent and kinship, but you're right. In the case of the EU, I would think of it more actually under a territorial conception of citizenship, and so it can kind of be perhaps split into, or can work for both of those categories. So it would really depend on the individual case. So I would have to think about that more too. In terms of proxies, so I have been thinking about these as kind of necessary grounds, however, with not a very explicit consumption of consent for the procedure, something that is a little bit more implicit. As I was saying, in the case of birthright citizenship, I think that you can make an argument that birth in of itself is sort of a consent. Well, the parent can consent on behalf of the child in terms of accessing the citizenship or accessing their citizenship. So again, I need to keep thinking about these and how they're operationalized, and how specifically to use them. So, I mean, all of your points are taken very well, and they're all things that I need to kind of further develop if I'm going to start operationalizing this this principle and moving forward. So thank you so much for all of that, and I'll certainly be back. I think get back to you on some of them.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I see that Martin has raised his hand. So Martin, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jelena. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot, Ashley, for a great paper and presentation. I think it's really interesting and exciting. And I think there is, even though this goes back to, the 50s already, and has been discussed a lot, I think actually, this is still very much a lively discussion, the genuine link doctrine. And I think it opens up avenues for comparative research and also normative thinking, and also perhaps legal standard setting, right? So I think it allows you to bring in many of these things that you are interested in. I have a question about, that starts with your typology, but then has implications for normative thinking and maybe also for legal standard setting. And that has to do with, on your typology, with the distinction between descent and territory. So that for me is a bit of maybe I would say that's maybe the wrong way of thinking about it. because I'm actually here about the work that Luca and I have been doing and that I presented on Tuesday morning. That will actually help you, because what we are now doing is identifying, right? And you may completely disagree, and that will be interesting if you have different categorizations, right? But what we are now doing with the global SIP modes data is think about categories of restrictions within certain conditions, right? Mm-hmm. And you can think especially about our mode A1B, sorry, this acquisition of citizenship by descent by people who are born abroad, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where we see that all countries in the world, the 190 we counted, actually have at least some kind of provision. So that's the only mode of acquisition or loss that is present in all countries in the world. So I think that's interesting. But quite a few countries have restrictions based on which we would call a genuine or sufficient link. Luke and I actually have been going back and forth a bit. I pushed for calling it a genuine link, especially to make it apparent that it relates to the discussions that you are bringing up. Luke was a bit reluctant because exactly for the same reason, that it sort of brings in this controversial genuine link discussion, whereas actually it is more about sort of identifying types of restrictions, right? Mm-hmm. But anyway, what we identify is that there are, 40, 50 countries that have what I would call a sufficient or genuine link restriction, that citizenship cannot be transmitted abroad by descent if, for example, the parent is also born abroad, or if the parent has not spent at least some time in the country of citizenship, or a person may have to take up residence later in life in order to claim the citizenship. So there are all kinds of restrictions there. And this actually shows you that, by only thinking about this as a descent, I think it's a misconception, because actually it's a transmission by descent, but with a territorial restriction. And I would say the main key element of the genuine link discussion is this territorial restriction within the descent-based transmission. So that will be a first typological comment, where I think, the main genuine link issue is not about that descent gives you the genuine link, but it's actually that if there is some kind of link to descent, that countries impose additional restrictions. Mm-hmm. And as I see it, that's not yet captured explicitly in your typology. Mm-hmm. Now, so first typological comment on this, and the second point is normative. About models, and I would be really interested to hear your view about this. And maybe this can be, you could think about, would be interesting to formulate, let's say, hard cases where you might want to develop very clearly your normative principles, where you might test this, right? And you have, of course, lots of different ways of going about, but at least one way, if you think about the descent-based transmission, you have countries that have right, and you see this especially with the Americas, that have a strong territorial conception of citizenship, so they have use solely, and those countries also typically tend to restrict transmission of citizenship abroad by some kind of generational limit, right? Mm-hmm. So the strong territorial notion transmits into descent-based transmission. And so they do a genuine link restriction for descent, right? And then you have countries like the Netherlands that have an unrestricted descent-based transmission. So, wherever you're born in the world, if one of your parents is a Dutch citizen, you will be Dutch. There's no restriction whatsoever, right? Mm-hmm. But then, of course, in the Netherlands, we're also concerned about genuine links or sufficient links. And we impose we try to safeguard this by doing a restriction later in life, right? Rainer already referred to this. So if you reside abroad, and nowadays it's if you reside outside of the EU, you have another citizenship, and you don't claim your Dutch passport, then you will lose it, right? And so these are two fundamentally different ways to, you could say, guarantee that at least over generations, there is some kind of genuine connection, right? Because yeah, and so countries deal with this differently. And my question to you is, I'm not sure if you have already a fully developed normative theory or conception, but in as far as you have a proto theory or conception, yeah, would this allow you to say that one way is better than the other, right? Or that, and a meta question about this, are you planning to make such a judgment call on this, right? And Rainer already introduced a main normative principle there, which is autonomy, right? Mm-hmm. And you then rebutted that autonomy also goes implicitly through birth of the parents. But yeah, you could say that the Dutch way is better in the sense that there is unrestricted citizenship, and a person can decide later in life whether he or she wants to maintain the link with the Netherlands, right? Just by, this basically is done by renewing the passport, right? So you claim, so this gives people more, it gives people more autonomy, right? But maybe it also has repercussions for the type of the link, right? So that's, I'm not sure. And then thirdly, a very short point on the legal implication, since you mentioned Jules Poutre, and right, if we talk about duration, we might think about 10 years. But in the Netherlands, we have, and you brought up the example of the Netherlands, so you will lose your Dutch citizenship if you don't claim it after 10 years. And that's linked to the passport, but that's actually problematic, right? Because exactly for that reason, we are currently discussing in the Netherlands to make the duration longer, to extend it to 15 years, right? Because nowadays, right, because it means that if if your passport is valid 10 years and you will only realize in, after 10 years that you need to, about when you get close to the deadline, that you need to renew it, and then then suddenly you may have lost your Dutch citizenship. So that actually happens to many people. So for that reason, we are actually extending the loss duration to 15 years so that it doesn't collide with the passport renewal period. Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. I'll let Ashley respond to your question.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll start with your second question, if that's, or your second point, if that's okay. So do I think that there is one, or will I come up with maybe, or do I think that there will be one way that is better than the other? I don't think so. I think that I'll be able to say something more along the lines of there's a good way in terms of within each of the categories of link that I suggest. So I won't say necessarily that the way that the North American states do it in terms of USOLI and then cutting that link after certain generations born abroad is better than a more descent-based intergenerational transfer. But I'll be able to say that within these sort of descent and kinship-based links, there's a good way of doing it, and perhaps not a good way of doing it. And I'm not sure if that's the right way to go about this, but that's just how I've been thinking about it as of yet, or as of late. And in terms of your first question, yes. So in terms of these sort of kind of complex cases when you have a descent-based principle that has an additional territorial element to it. This is again some of these hard cases, but the way I'd been thinking about it until now is that the basis is still descent-based. Like the primary, even though there is a territorial condition to it or restriction, the base of the mode is still descent. And so that's why I thought about putting it under these descent and kinship-based categories. But I can definitely keep thinking about this if this is the right way to go about it. And to your third point, yeah, I mean, about the debate in the Netherlands and changing it to from 10 years to 15 years. Yeah, I think these sort of time limits, and when I'm talking about durational time, yeah, it's difficult to really set a standard that doesn't, as I was saying, that doesn't seem completely arbitrary. And yeah, maybe Jules, yeah, as I said, obviously mentions 10 years, but yeah, for people, for example, that yeah, maybe don't have a passport but still have maintained ties to a state in some way, maybe 15 years makes more sense, or so I need to keep thinking about whether and how these time limits are set, and if
right. And of course, sorry, just to interrupt, but of course the Court of Justice ruling that from last year, I forgot now which one that was, but with the Canadian family, for example, the combined cases. Where the court actually has implied that there has to be some kind of consent. So we are rethinking the whole regulation now in the Netherlands, right? Whether this actually holds up in light of EU law, and whether there should be actually a consent-based withdrawal procedure rather than the automatic lapse, right? So that is open for debate, I think, still.
Yeah, the Chavez case, yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you. Now, I would like to use my prerogative as a chair of this session to ask Ashley a question, and I think she pretty much knows what's coming. I'm going to ask you about the normative grounds for your proxies, and essentially, I wanted to ask you about the notions of residence and time, and how those two play out in the context of determining genuine links. Because if you think about residence, it can denote legal residency or the actual fact of physical presence, and the two may overlap to a certain degree or be completely independent of one another. And I'll give you the example of the Portuguese investor citizenship program versus Portuguese regular residence, whereby in the first you need to be physically present in Portugal for a week each year. In the second one, you actually need to spend at least six consecutive months on the country's soil. In both cases, after 6 years, you receive Portuguese citizenship. How can you essentially differentiate between the two types of the connection, of the way it's kind of this connection between the individual time and territory is related? So this is one question. So how do you justify and operationalize legal versus social reality in the domains of administering the relationship between time and physical space and individuals' social reality?
This is such a good question, Jelena, and I know we've been talking, I mean, in our exchanges, when you've been reviewing drafts of the paper, this always comes up, and I wish I had a good answer for it, but I don't yet. And because, I mean, as we've discussed, so both residency and time can be thought of in these legal senses. So what is exactly is in the law, and this more, I guess, the actual time or actual residence, which can be completely outside of the scope of the ground for acquisition and loss. And I think it comes down to this nexus between migration law and citizenship law, and And I know it's a complete cop-out to say, but I don't have a good answer for this, but it's on my mind, and I'm trying to, it's another thing that I'm trying to sort out when I think about these, I think about operationalizing these proxies, because I mean, obviously it wouldn't do justice to the topic without, I mean, taking into account that many people live in a state for 10 years before they're even able to apply for citizenship, and then have another 5 years before they can even access it. So so it's on my mind, and I'm interested in if you have any ideas, not just throw the question back at you, but interested in discussing it further with you going forward.
Thank you for throwing back the question at me. In order not to monopolize your session, I will just hand over to Johanna, and then we'll have two further comments from Leah and then Emilienne, but I will let Ashley respond after each question. So Johanna, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashley, for the paper. It's really exciting to see this moving forward. I was curious how your thinking was about the expectations you have as to how states behave. So this relates a little bit to Reiner's hidden dimensions and to the relation between the different domains of links to each other, and whether you expect, like if there's tensions between them, whether you would expect states to be coherent or not, and also to the mirroring between loss and acquisition. So you do this conceptually, but it's interesting to maybe just for you at the stage to spell out whether you expect states to behave coherently and have, when they have modes for acquisition in one link, then that there will also be the loss categories there, or whether you don't expect anything at this point. But I think it might be interesting for you to spell that out for yourself, and then see what you find and how that relates to what you're thinking now.
Yeah, thanks, Johanna. And also, I don't have a strong sort of inkling on how states behave. I don't necessarily expect there to be coherence, and I think it depends on what level of coherence we're talking about. I don't know if that completely makes sense, but if we're talking about whether I think like policy makers are coherent when they're developing the provisions for citizenship acquisition and loss, and if there's a coherent conception of state identity that they're using, then I don't think so. Or if I think there's some coherence within the law in this sort of mirroring effect, I'm not sure. That's something that it's kind of the next stage of the project to dive into more, because I am quite interested in this mirroring effect. But at this stage, I don't have a very clear idea or hypothesis of what I will find. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Johanna, and thank you, Ashley, for following up. Leah.
Thank you. I think that the genuine link doctrine is one of the most discussed issues in international citizenship law, and at the same time, it's also one of the most understudied topics in international citizenship law. I mean, Reiner has done lots of work on that, more on the theoretical level, but for international law scholars, this is almost like an untouched topic. And just a follow-up, this is more commented than a question on Martin's point connected to what you said, Ashley. I think there are lots to be said on those legal standards, because until recently, the genuine link was taking to say at least one important thing, that the state can refuse citizenship in the absence of those genuine link. But it can also say two other things, not only that the state can refuse, or it would be lawful to refuse to grant citizenship in the absence of any genuine link, but also number two, that even if the state wishes to grant citizenship in the absence of any link, this is not for granted that it's lawfully So it's legally permissible. So this is the case of, let's say, the investment citizenship, or that the European Commission says, yeah, but we doubt whether this is a sufficient link to get citizenship. But it also says something, or at least possibly one can argue that it can say a third thing, that if there are some sufficient genuine link, at one point, if the links are strong enough and genuine enough, it would be unlawful for the states to refuse citizenship. So in a way, it can lead the kind of, from a legal perspective, the way to claim under a certain condition, and we can discuss what this condition should be, into the direction of the right to citizenship. When the links are so sufficient to the point that it would become unlawful to refuse citizenship. So these are the three things that the genuine link can say. Number one, that the state can legitimately or lawfully refuse citizenship under certain condition, the lack of any links. Number two, that even if the state wished to grant with no links, it might not be possible under international law. And number three, that at one point there might be a right to citizenship if the links are so genuine. And I think that at the end, which directions or where do you want to take it from a normative perspective also depends on which philosophy or which doctrine of international law and values and principles you want to promote. And in most cases, I would imagine that something that can be feasible for international law would leave it for the state discretions, except for those extreme, which might be those cases in which it's legally impermissible and legally mandatory to grant citizenship. So I think that from a normative perspective, there lots to be said. And having said that, this empirical and conceptual work that this paper reflecting would be a pivotal, kind of a very central point in reflecting on those philosophy and theories and see what states are doing, and then to take it to something which is normative and asking what state should be doing.
Thank you so much, Leah. Ashley?
I mean, I agree with, thank you so much for the comment. I agree with everything that you said. Yeah, perhaps we can discuss more when we meet next about some of these sort of normative implications and how we can kind of intertwine them into the paper more.
Thank you. And I will hand over to Emilienne, and I think that I will see if we will have time for another quick question, but I doubt that. So Emilienne, please.
Yes, many thanks, Ashley, for such an interesting presentation and paper, and I'm also very excited to see this project moving forward. So I have a question on the table and the typology that relates different modes of acquisition and loss to different categories of link, and in particular on the specific position of ordinary naturalization within this typology, because I see that in the table it features within the category of link that is called territory. And I see why, obviously, because this mode of citizenship acquisition is very much related to residence. But I mean, there are many other requirements also that that matter to become to be granted naturalization. And you could also make the case that, well, it could feature, you know, in the category of link that relates to merit or contribution. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, you know, if it would make sense or if it would have any interest perhaps to disaggregate perhaps different modes of loss or acquisition depending on the different requirements, or even another approach that would be more based on the, let's say, the different requirements, different conditions to be granted citizenship, or to lose your citizenship would have sense.
Yeah, thanks. I think this relates very much to Martin's first point. and yeah, that there are some potentially hard cases. I mean, as you know, or as you said, the reason why ordinary naturalization is put under territory-based is because of the primary, I guess, condition is that that you have residency in the country in which you're applying for citizenship in. But of course, yeah, all these conditions attached to it make it a little bit more complex. And I mean, perhaps this is also thinking through these sorts of things is how I can, further develop the dimensionality that even Reiner suggested in terms of how I'm presenting this in this typology. But yeah, again, it's these links become very intertwined when you start thinking about all of the conditions and criteria attached to them. So, yeah, I leave it in territory for now, with the caveat that maybe disaggregating makes sense, and perhaps with the new sort of global sit modes that Martin and Luke are working on, that will become easier to do, and maybe I will reshuffle, but yeah, it's definitely something that's on my mind and that I'm thinking about as well. But yeah, thank you for highlighting that.
Thank you. So I think it's time for us to close slowly this session. I would like to thank Ashley for having presented her paper, and to everyone else who commented on her work. So I hope that this will be helpful to you to go ahead in your PhD and in your endeavor with this paper. And with this, I would also like to remind you that we will have further two Global Citizenship online seminar series on May 13th. Wessel Reyers and Liav will present their paper on China's social credit system. So I'd kindly invite you to come along.
Coming a book, Yelena, already.
Excuse me?
It's no longer a paper, it's becoming a book. Hopefully in June it will be ready.
Oh, excellent. Then we will have the opportunity to hear, to have a book promotion before the book has actually even been published. So thank you so much for that, Liav. And on the 27th of May, we will have a presentation by Mira Seyfettinoglu on the joint paper with Ayelet Shahar, Martin, and myself on investor citizenship in the world. So we're looking forward to seeing all of you in our next session. And with this, I thank you and I wish you a good afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.